Okay, we're in the third Mishnah of the first chapter of Pirkei Avos, where Antigonus is Socho Kibel Mishimna Tzadik. Antigonus, the man of Socho, that's the location he came from, he received from Shimon Tzadik in the tradition, Hoy Omer. And there's a very fundamental principle. Al Tiu Kavodim Shamshin Sarav. You should not be as subjects who serve the master, for the sake of receiving reward. But rather you should be subjects who serve the master, not for the sake of reward. Do it altruistically, purely for the sake of the master, not with any self-interest. It should be done selflessly, for the sake of the master, not for one's own personal interest. No ulterior motive. Now, a person keeps the law, doesn't violate the law, although he would want to. And the only reason why he's keeping the law, because he doesn't want to be penalized or incarcerated. Would that person be considered an upright citizen? Because he's not a criminal. But the only reason why he's not a criminal, he's not going to break the laws, because his only interest is he doesn't want to go to prison. You'd say, well, he's a law-abiding citizen, but he's not an upright citizen. Upright citizen means he really respects the laws and he relates to them because he understands it's the best interest of the country or the community to uphold the law. He's only upholding the law in terms of the community. He couldn't care less. It's only because he's concerned of the consequences that if he crosses lines which he shouldn't cross, he'll be penalized, he'll be incarcerated. That person is abiding the law, he's keeping the law, but he's not an upright citizen. So if the value of a Jew's behavior, the way you grade it and evaluate it, God created this existence for one reason, for his own glory, for his glory. What does his glory mean? That if you recognize that he is the master and you behave as a subject, then there's a basis to have a relationship with him. But if you don't acknowledge that and you live as you choose to live, there's no basis for a relationship, because you have to merit the worthiness to have that relationship. So a person keeps the Torah, doesn't transgress, violate the Torah laws, the negative commandments, and he keeps the positive commandments, only because he doesn't want to be punished. That's the only reason. What is the nature of that kind of relationship? He says to God, factually, I would cross every line, except I believe it's not worth it. So it's not I'm concerned about your honor or your glory. I'm concerned about myself, because I don't want to be punished. I don't want to be hurt. I don't want to be pained. And the reason why I'm doing what you want me to do is not because I have interest in any relationship with you, but rather it's self-interest. So you should decree I should have financial success. I should have acknowledgement. I should have fame. I should have glory. So if the basis is to have a relationship with God, and God knows man's intent, so what is the quality of that type of service? It falls short of what's meant to be. So what level of relationship could you have with that kind of attitude and interest where you have no interest in God? Your interest is purely focused on yourself. So therefore, it's very logical to understand, although you don't deserve to be punished, but if the ultimate share in the world to come is based on your relationship with him, that's what it's about. You have no relationship with him. You have a relationship with yourself, except you're abiding the law because you want to maintain yourself. You want to secure yourself. You want to be the ultimate beneficiary for yourself, but it has nothing to do with God. As a result of that, it's considered a very paltry level of service. It's deficient. But if a person serves God, selflessly committed to his glory, it's for God's sake, not for your own sake. The reason why I don't do the wrong thing is not because I'm concerned about the consequence, but rather, so God says I shouldn't transgress. I shouldn't cross that line because I acknowledge God's will. I value God's will. So I'm doing it for God. If you do it for God's sake, as we say, then there's a basis to have a relationship. Of course, I'm suppressing my inclinations, which are contrary to that, for the sake of God. If the God says, that means you're willing to put yourself through a difficult situation for the sake of God, therefore you're worthy of a relationship. And therefore we have the principle, as we read later in Pirkei Avos, Fum Tzara Agra. The greater the pain, the greater the difficulty, which indicates the greater level of dedication, the more worthy you are to receive reward. A reward is determined by what one's level of sacrifice. The greater the sacrifice, the more worthy you are. Because who are you sacrificing for? Are you sacrificing for yourself, or are you sacrificing for God? When you sacrifice for God, God says, I'm there for you. We have a relationship. Because God is your priority, you're not the priority. Therefore, what Atigdish and Socha says the name of Shimon HaTzadik is very logical. When you serve the master, don't serve it for the sake of reward. But you should serve it not for the sake of reward. Ultimately, you'll be rewarded. The reward will be even greater. It's a famous story with the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was the equivalent, he lived his life like an angel, literally. He barely had any relevance to the physical existence. Fully invested in Torah, barely ate, barely slept. And he was the equivalent of his holiness was one of a kind. His greatness was so advanced that he even surpassed people in Torah greatness hundreds of years who lived before him, which is not the norm. So the Vilna Gaon would send out an agent already in Tammuz, that's the first month in the summer, to seek out an esrog for him for Sukkot, because he always wanted to have the most perfect esrog. And cost was never an issue. He was willing to give his last dollar for that special esrog. So he sends out an agent to seek out that beautiful esrog for the 4 species. And that year was a terrible crop. And there was a lack of esrogim. But he told the agent, whatever it costs, just buy it. Because the mitzvah is my priority to have that beautiful esrog. He travels the length and breadth of Europe, can't locate that esrog. Finally, he hears in a certain town, there's a very wealthy Jew, because of his level of wealth, he purchased that special esrog. And he travels there, and he inquires, and he locates this person, and he asks the person, he says, I heard you were able, despite the bad crop this year, you were able to locate something very unusual in beauty. And he shows it to him. He's like amazed of how beautiful that esrog was. And he says, I am the Vilna Gaon's agent. He sent me to search, to leave no stone unturned to find that special esrog. I would want to buy it for you. For any price you ask, I will pay. Even though it'll be maybe multiples of what you paid, I'm willing to pay for it. Because the Vilna Gaon wants the esrog. So the man says, he says, I'm a very wealthy man. Whatever the Vilna Gaon's going to pay doesn't mean anything to me. Because I don't need the money. But I want to do the mitzvah. And I want to do the mitzvah with that most special esrog, the beautiful esrog. But the agent doesn't let up. The Vilna Gaon's agent doesn't let up. And he says to him, but you realize, you know what it means? The Vilna Gaon should have that special esrog. And we should be able to satisfy his mitzvah need. And he keeps communicating this importance of the Vilna Gaon getting the esrog. So he stops for a moment and he thinks, he says, look, money is not the issue. I'm not interested in the money, but I'll do a deal with you. If the Vilna Gaon is willing to give me a share in the world to come for the esrog, I'm willing to give him the esrog. And if not, I'm not willing to give him the esrog. That is the price for the esrog. Because with all the money in the world, to have the Vilna share in the world to come, it's not possible. That is the price. So the agent says to this man, he says, look, I have no choice. I will buy it for the Vilna share in the world to come. And he sold it. He purchased it. And the seller now has the Vilna share in the world. You can imagine what this is. A man who lived his life as an angel, not to waste a moment, fully invested. He returns back to Vilna, and literally he's trembling. Because when he bought it with his Vilna Gold share in the world to come, he didn't consult with the Vilna Gold. He assumed that the Vilna Gold would be in agreement, even for that price. So he gets back to Vilna, and the Vilna Gold says to this person, to his agent, what did it cost me? What did it cost? He says, it cost the Vilna Gold all his merits in the world to come. His share in the world to come, that's what I bought it for. The Vilna Gaon says to this person, Baruch Hashem, thank God, now I could do a mitzvah lishma. I could do the mitzvah selflessly, without any self-interest. Because, very often on a subconscious level, we believe we do things altruistically, selflessly, but behind the scenes, we have our own interest in mind. But now he says that the purchase price was I shared the world to come. Baruch Hashem, now I could do that mitzvah selflessly, without any compensation. This is the ultimate level, serving the master not for the sake of reward. So what they used to say, when the Vilna Gaon said that he's willing to do the mitzvah selflessly because he purchased it with the share in the world to come, he gave it all away for the mitzvah, the value of that mitzvah, which was based upon giving away his whole life for that mitzvah, in the world to come has greater value than his original share in the world to come. Because this is the ultimate level, serving the master not for the sake of reward. To give up your share in the world to come to do the will of God, that means the will of God is premier and primary, and there's nothing more important. And whatever it takes to address it, I'm willing to give that. That's called selfless sacrifice for God's glory. And when you sacrifice selflessly at that level, then you merit the ultimate. But that's the concept of Mishamshus es Rav Shlomo Amnas Klaba Pras. You're serving the master not for the sake of reward, but rather for the sake of the master. And that's what we call for God's sake. Now the question is, if a person, not everybody, nobody's born a tzaddik. And as we grow and advance and we become more aware of innate value, our intent changes. But initially, to get a person going, there has to be some of that ulterior motive. Because the person doesn't have yet a full appreciation for what God's laws are, or who God is. He's not sufficiently acquainted with God. Once you become acquainted, you have a sense, you can internalize the value, then we can talk about doing it for the sake of God. So everybody starts Lodeshmon, not for the sake of the mitzvah. The Rav Chaim Lodeshmon explains it with a moshel, with an allegory. The king says to his subject, I want you to go from the first floor to the second floor and then to the roof. And there's no staircase. So how does he get to the roof? So he has to fashion a ladder, put it up against the wall, and he climbs from the ground floor to the upper floor. But what about if the wall itself, the story is only within 5 feet above him, and he's able to scale that wall to achieve that, and he stands still and does nothing? There's a very serious claim against that person. To go from the ground floor to the roof of the second floor, you can't do that with one leap. It's beyond the person's capacity. Therefore, the king understands. He says, I have to fashion a ladder, and I will go step by step, eventually achieving that to arrive on the roof. But if you're within grasp, within reach, and you have the understanding already, and yet you don't do it in one leap, when you have the capacity to do it in one leap, then there's a claim against the person. So he says, nobody starts off lishma. Nobody. Everybody has initially a self-interest. Once we have an appreciation for the value of what we do, then we don't need compensation, because we recognize serving the master in itself, that it's the value itself, the privilege itself is sufficient for the person to motivate himself to be committed for that ideal, for that objective. You should serve the master not for the sake of oneself, which is the compensation, the reward, but rather serve him not for the sake of reward. You serve him because you recognize the master. And that's the basis for reverence, because I recognize who you are, therefore I revere you. Therefore, I'm dedicated to you, or to whatever level God wants you should be dedicated to him. When I finished that, he says, "V'hi moreh shamayim aleichem," and you should have the fear of God upon you. So let's talk about Lodeshmon. You do it with an ulterior motive. What is its value? What's its value? So Gemara tells us in a number of locations, la'olam, and Rav Chaim Vilosh makes la'olam. Yasuk odom b'torah mitzvahs Lodeshmon. La'olam means it's set in stone, etched in stone. A person should always engage in Torah mitzvahs, not for the selfish reasons, not for altruistic reasons. Lodeshmon. You should be told Lodeshmon b'lishmon. Because we begin with the ulterior motive level, with self-interest level, but ultimately we're able to be brought to that more advanced level, to do it for the sake of the mitzvah. So Rav Chaim Vilosh asks, what does it say, la'olam? For always. It says, Yasuk Adam Shlo Lishmo, Shtoch Shlo Lishmo. The answer is, the olam, the word la'olam means forever. There's no other way to do it other than that way. That's what it's saying. Nobody's born a malach. Nobody's born with that absolute clarity that you appreciate the value of doing the right thing for the right reason. Everybody starts off at a Lodeshmon level. Ulterior motives with self-interest. La'olam, forever, that's the reality. It's the reality of every human being. Where do we all start? We all start that you can't leap to the second story and you got to take the staircase to the roof. That's the only way to get there. There's no other way to get there. And God has no claim. But the question is, until you get there, until you achieve that, what exactly is the reward for the Lodeshmon? Does one get reward? Because the intent was not the proper intent when you did it. So the Gemara says, you should, even with an ulterior motive, should be told was within the realm of doing it for self-interest. It has the innate ability to bring you to that selfless, altruistic level of service, purely for the sake of the master. Who is the grandmother? Who is the grandfather of Rus? Rus HaMovia, Rus the Moabite. Who is her grandfather? She was a convert. She converted. Naomi had two daughters-in-law, Orpah and Rus. Both of the husbands died. And Rus was told, go back to the plains of Moab. And Orpah, the other wife, said, go back. Orpah went back. Rus would not go back. And ultimately she converted, and she is the great-grandmother of David HaMelech, King David. That's Rus. Now, who was Rus's grandfather? Rus's grandfather was Balak, the king of Moab. We read how he commissioned Bilam to curse the Jewish people. He himself was the grandfather of Rus. Now, how does a man like that merit such a special granddaughter? To generate that level of spirituality. So the more answers, since Balak himself, when he commissioned Bilam, and Bilam says to him, the only way we're going to be able to get in the word edgewise, to curse the Jews, we have to bring sacrifices to Hashem. Although Moloch was a pagan. But when he built those altars and brought sacrifices, they were brought for God. It was not idolatry. And he built 7 altars and brought the sacrifice on these altars for God. But why did he bring those sacrifices? To ingratiate himself with God, that he should allow Bilam to curse the Jewish people. So that's Lodeshmon. It was not serving God for God. It was serving God with a personal interest, a self-interest, that this should allow him to destroy the Jewish people. That's Lodeshmon. However, but since he did bring a korban, a sacrifice to God, in that marriage, he merited to have Ruas Hamovi as his granddaughter. So from there we learn that although he did it with this self-interest, not for the sake of God, you see it has value. Because it merited that, that's why he merited Ruas Hamovi to be his granddaughter, who ultimately was the mother of what? Of David HaMelech. That's what happened. She was the mother of David, or the maternal line of David. That's what it was. So we see that even though it was done almost with an evil intent, you're only using it as leverage to ingratiate yourself with God, that Bilam should be able to curse the Jewish people nevertheless. But since the korban, the sacrifice brought for God, that has value. But you couldn't have done it with a greater self-interest. Nevertheless, it generates great value. Ruas Hamovi. So from there we learn, La'olam, always do mitzvahs initially, Lodeshmon. The question is, how quickly do you get to that level of internalization that you understand the greater value is when you do it for the sake of the master. But even at the most deficient level, it has value, as we see by Ruas Hamovi. The Rechaim HaKodesh explains, the Gemara tells us a number of locations that the only antidote for the evil inclination is the study of Torah. However, he says it only works as an antidote if you do it, you study the Torah Lishma. If you study Torah for the sake of the Torah, then it's the antidote. But if you study the Torah with a self-interest, with an ulterior motive, although you're credited for studying Torah, it does not incapacitate the evil inclination. It's only if you study selflessly, altruistically, for the sake of the Torah itself. Then you merit that divine protection, which incapacitates Satan. But if you do it with self-interest, for honor, for glory, for financial compensation, it doesn't work. It doesn't incapacitate the evil inclination. The question is why? Why not? If I have a fire and I have water, regardless of what my intent is, if the fire goes on the water, it extinguishes the water. The water extinguishes the fire. But yet, if you study Torah with self-interest, it doesn't have the ability to quench and incapacitate the evil inclination. The question is, why not? Now, what is the evil inclination? Evil inclination, only because we're made of physical, a human being is a composite of physical and spiritual. The soul is totally spiritual, the body is physical. All the inclinations we're inclined to do, when we gravitate after the physical, is due to our bodies, not due to our soul. The challenge is, who has the upper hand, the soul or the body? When the body begins craving for whatever it may be, does the person have the ability to suppress it for the sake of the soul, or no? He's taken by the body, totally subsumed by the cravings of the body. That means the soul lost out. I study not for the sake of the mitzvah. I have an ulterior motive. The moment you have the ulterior motive, Where does that ulterior motive emanate from? From your physicality, from your spirituality? I want glory. I want acknowledgement. I want financial compensation. So where's that emanating from? It's not the soul. It's emanating from the body. The only thing which emanates from the neshama, if you study Torah for the sake of the Torah, and that's not the representation of the group here we're speaking about. So that's why he says, when is Torah tavlin? When is Torah the antidote? If it's studied selflessly. So it's not related to the person. The person is the physicality. It's outside the physicality. What's outside physicality, it incapacitates the satan, the evil inclination. But if it's within the physicality, it emanates my acknowledgement, my financial package, or whatever it may be, then that's not, it's lacking the purity of the Torah. Maybe the words, but the purity is absent. And because of that, that level of Torah cannot actually incapacitate the evil inclination. Okay. Stop here. We're going to do tefillah. I just want to shut it, and we're going to get back to start it over.